Hello and welcome to this week's Culture Clash. Now, during an interview earlier this year, the National Theatre's director Nicholas Heitner said that one thing he would really like to see there in the future would be a good, mischievous right-wing play. Now, the underlying implication in Heitner's statement that such a production would be an unusual occurrence, a sort of guilty pleasure, would certainly have confirmed many in their conviction that the cultural establishment in general stands firmly behind left liberal lines. The right may have won the economic battles, but in the culture wars, the left were ultimately victorious. But is this really true? And if it's not, why are there no more alternative voices? Do not conservatives, or indeed anyone else who is opposed to the increasingly stifling and predictable liberal left line, do these kinds of things? There is the rather complacent view, still cleaved to in the cultural establishment, that the broadly speaking the right conserves and the left creates, and that the most enduring art has to be subversive to survive. However, where does that leave such giant figures as Evelyn Waugh, Noel Coward or Edward Elgar, to name just a few from this country alone? What does seem undeniable is that if there are right-of-centre artists or writers out there now, they're certainly keeping a low profile. Or is it possible that we're just looking at this the wrong way? With me to discuss this are Michael Attwell, TV producer and a former chairman of BAFTA, Susan Shaw, senior producer at the South Bank Show, writer and commentator Douglas Murray, and Clive Davis, journalist and regular contributor to the Times and the Washington Times. So thank you all very much for coming. I want to start, Douglas, when was the last time you saw a good, mischievous right-wing play?
Well, I've never seen one. I mean, certainly not by a modern playwright. Sadly, we all know what you're likely to get if you go to the National or, God forbid, the Royal Court or something in this country. Usually you simply get a piece of kind of half-boiled, very, very dated piece of agitprop, something like Carol Churchill's just brought out again, something that adds nothing particularly to the debate, but tries to add to the debate, for instance, about George Bush or something like that. If that's cutting edge, then, I mean, we've got a problem, but that's what is considered cutting edge.
This is the new play called Drunk Enough to Say I Love You. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it was reviewed this week. And it's essentially a dissection, isn't it, of our supposed love affair with America.
An attempted dissection.
Yes, and it's solidly anti-American. How about you? I mean, do you bother? I mean, do you go to the theatre much? Do you find that there is something that's actually going to be in some ways challenging, or do you expect the same kind of line?
Well, I think it's interesting because there are figures like Terry Johnson, for example, who's a very, very exciting playwright who came through the Royal Court, who's politically unclassifiable at some levels. I mean, his plays are often about existing figures. Hitchcock, his last play was called Blonde. It was about Hitchcock's obsession with blonde. And actually, if I had to pigeonhole him in some areas, I'd probably put him to the right of centre, in that I think he accepts a sort of cultural entrepreneurship. He accepts the cultural marketplace. There's no hand-wringing. He's not saying how terrible it is. He's saying these are the people that entertain and fascinate us. But I know for a fact, having met the man, that he does feel quite apart and separate from the liberal theocracy in the theatre, and from a sort of hand-wringing kind of sensibility within that. I think he feels like the sort of Barrow boy amongst the poshies.
Yeah.
There we are.
I think that, that when Heitner said this, made this remark earlier this year, it was sort of considered to be, quite a novel and interesting thing for him to say, but it seems, I said at the beginning now, to presuppose that there aren't really any right-wing playwrights. I mean, having said that, a big hit at the National recently was The History Boys, which was, I think, was put forward as being somehow a conservative play. I mean, you saw that, didn't you, Michael?
I did. I mean, I should say, I find myself in a slightly odd position here because, I don't really know what a right-wing play is, and I don't actually think that this epithet really describes the world that we live in. I think it's a hangover from a previous era. Right. I may be wrong about this, I'd be interested to know people's views. Yeah. But, for me, left-wing, right-wing relates very much to a struggle in the 60s between socialism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. And there was a whole set of ideas and ideology that came with the left, and there was a right-wing, response to that. But, that battle is over. Socialism is dead. There's a broad consensus, not only within the UK, but globally, that, capitalism has won. It may not be perfect, but it's the best we've got. So that debate is over, and one wouldn't expect to see that reflected in our culture because there's no longer a discussion. So what's a right-wing play then? I mean, I don't understand what a right-wing play would be.
But this is one of the arguments, isn't it? In fact, the theatre, I think that Julian Fellows, the screenwriter of Gossip Park, is that if this is true and these labels no longer really exist, it seems very much that he said that the theatre is stuck during a time when, in fact, they did very much exist, and that essentially they are still putting out the same kind of approach as maybe, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, is this something you feel?
Well, it's true. We still have this 68 generation, I suppose, which dominates not just the theatre, but the arts in general. So it's going to be a generational thing until we move on to a generation that came of age when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, which will create some more interesting work. I mean, I was trying to think as I came in of any plays I'd seen in the past 10 years. I wouldn't want a play to follow a right-wing argument anyway, because once you have a message, that kills the work of art anyway.
But so many of them do. I mean, it's
They
interesting.
do, they're bad.
When you say that you don't really know what a right-wing or what does this mean, and the fact is I sort of feel that I do by default know, because I certainly know what a left-wing play is. I mean, I know when I see it, it's a play.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, the only thing I've seen in the theatre in the last, couple of, I suppose, last year, I mean, I saw the History Boys. Yeah. Well, the History Boys is essentially an argument in favour of a traditional form of, factually based teaching, which is, if anything, conservative with a small c. Mary Poppins, which is essentially about, family values, I guess, and The Sound of Music, So, and these are the things that most people are going to the theatre to see. So I dare say there are loads and loads of people who are out there in little theatres all over the country still putting on kind of, hangover plays from the 60s about sort of clapped-out old, Czechoslovakian, Eastern European type, dramas. But if they are, they're irrelevant.
Well, yes, I mean, it's always nice to hear somebody who says that socialism is dead. Sadly, of course, I mean, this city, among others, is being ruined by socialists at the moment. So, I mean, socialism is live and well.
That's a different thing.
Socialism is live and well, and if it isn't, somebody's got to tell the playwrights, because they're certainly still fighting dead battles. In this
like
case.
what? Give me an example.
For instance, I mean, you say the capitalist system, for instance. I mean, anti-capitalism is one of the sort of tenets of the left, which, I mean, you don't see pro-capitalist plays because we assume that it's fine, and no one wants to have that sort of thing extolled to them. It's why they're sitting in a theatre in the first place and why it's subsidised and everything else. But to get back to this one, I mean, it is a problem defining right-wing plays or something like that, and I don't think it does exist as such. If we did come to a definition of right-wing or something as simply conservative, and if conservative was, as you say, the History Boys, pass it on, tradition, then that says a very sad thing about what we think of conservatism. I mean, a lot of people thought, for instance, the Falklands play was a kind of right-wing play as such. But the Falklands play, if it was right-wing at all, was simply right-wing in that it wanted Britain to win. Yes, I mean, do you remember it was the Ian Curtis play that was on BBC finally after many, many years. He got it on, but I think apparently the BBC just thought it was too jingoistic. It's extraordinary. Because it was essentially supporting Thatcher in a way.
It's particularly bizarre when you think that the British are the most warlike and militaristic nation on earth.
There are others.
Well, no, but I mean, Britain, I speak as somebody who's South African by origin, but, actually, Britain's got a fantastic long tradition of militarism and being very, very good at it, and give them a war and they're in there, V-Day, the Middle East. So it's very odd that the British Broadcasting Corporation doesn't seem to reflect that.
But, when again, there's this idea that, that great art has to be subversive in whatever form. Okay, even if you accept that, then in that case there's quite a lot to subvert at the moment, isn't there? I mean, we've got a kind of general political correctness in thought. Why isn't that being subverted? Why is it that the criticism, when it comes, particularly, for example, in the theatre, it tends to be from the left anyway, and it certainly does on television too?
Is the theatre really a central part of our culture?
I think it sort of is, oddly. It's not in a popular sense, but I think a lot is, a lot of credibility is put into the theatre, and I think it's judged as being important. I think that's the most important part of it.
Yeah, amongst commentators take it very seriously, but beyond the small circle of people who write in the Sunday papers and the daily papers, is the theatre really exerting a great influence?
Perhaps one of the reasons why it's not more relevant is because people feel that they're going to get the same thing.
Yeah.
Possibly. I mean,
you could look at. I mean, you could certainly look at the same thing in sort of polluting film at the moment as well, and has done for a while. I mean, even that a kind of vaguely sort of pro-war or something movie, a war movie. Now, really, it's very hard to have a war movie that doesn't try to sort of pass left-wing agitprop anti-war messages. I'm thinking of something like Kingdom of Heaven, which was essentially a sort of anti-Christian, anti-war rant. The new movie, The Flag of Our Fathers, that can't even talk about American heroism in the Second World War without trying desperately to undermine it and to say, you know, it was all for nothing or something.
But film is actually put forward as being the most right-wing art form. I mean, isn't that to confuse in some ways the making of a thing with the actual object? I mean, would you say that, Susan? Would you say it's a, you know, would you say that, for example, you know, if you have the films that Douglas has just mentioned, is Love Actually, is that a right-wing film, for example? Is a Richard Curtis film a right-wing film, just because it portrays certain sorts of people?
I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, we know that Clint Eastwood and Schwarzenegger as Republicans are oxymorons in a Hollywood context, because Hollywood is dominated, perhaps even to a greater degree than our media here, by a Democrat kind of sensibility and a blanket sort of buying into the anti-war movement and so on. And Eastwood and Schwarzenegger are the great, as I say, contradictions to all of that. I don't know. I mean, the closest... what was the film with Sandra Bullock in it? Just recently, it was a film that was a more realistic take on race relations. Crash signalled some sort of movement away from a completely glutinous, multicultural sentimentalism that has characterised so much of Hollywood's output. But it was just a sort of glimmering of the possibility of a new trend in filmmaking.
But if you think of our film industry, I mean, for example, Stephen Frears did a film which got quite a few awards called Dirty Pretty Things. I don't know whether you heard or saw it. It came out a couple of years ago. It was about how terrible it is for illegal immigrants working in London and how they're exploited. It was actually, it was a good film and on its own merits, as it were. But I sort of thought at the time, why would we never see a film which, say, took a white couple, maybe an older white couple, who'd seen their whole area around them transformed by immigration, and you'd think that would have quite a few dramatic possibilities there, wouldn't you? You know, I mean, why not take that as a context? Why is it inconceivable that we'd see that? Is it because people won't commission it? Is it because people aren't writing it? What is it?
Both, I imagine.
Yes, and a lot of people, of course, in the arts at the moment, if you include film in the arts, a lot of them do think that part of their job is to somehow educate the public.
Yes.
That the public is somehow reactionary, right-wing, possibly racist, and that it's the job of the arts to sort of enlighten them. If it is the job of the arts, they're doing a very bad job at the moment.
But in fact, I think somebody, I think it might have been Heitner actually, said that the arts actually should support the underdog. Now, is that what the arts should be doing?
Not purely, but I mean, Charles Dickens, going back to 19th century, Charles Dickens would have been regarded by most of the people here as subversive, left-wing, but he did it very well, and was in a climate where he was maybe the exceptional voice. You had someone like Trollope who would be more respectable. We just seem to have lost a sense of balance, don't you think? I mean,
Yes, I mean, we now accept, do we not, that basically the arts somehow should be on the left, but this wasn't always the case, was it? But I mean, the fact remains is that, you know, this is all very well to complain about it, but I mean, you know, where are people of different voices? Do they just not do it? If not, why not?
Well, I'm not sure it's as kind of simple a scenario as we're perhaps assuming, in that I think there's been an explosion of anti-political correctness. Borat, Little Britain, as I was sort of
Catherine
saying.
Tate.
That's right. There are playwrights.
Really politically incorrect, do you think?
Well, they're anti-political correctness. And also, I mean, Stephen Frears, you mentioned Stephen Frears. The most recent Stephen Frears film, which, you know, we've all seen recently, is The Queen.
Yes.
Well, yeah, it would have been very easy for Stephen Frears to make a very glib, kind of anti-monarchical tirade, you know, all the raw material there. Actually, it's a very subtle, complicated film, which in the end is, pro-monarchy. And, Helen Mirren herself said she went in making the film being Republican and came out loving the Queen. Well, it seems to me, there's that. The other film I've seen recently is James Bond. Well, I mean, it was written by Ian Fleming, and it couldn't be more patriotic, as it were. Well, so I sort of think, as I keep saying, this whole thing about right-wing, left-wing in the area of culture, it just seems to me you're fighting a battle which is not the battle anymore. I mean, political correctness is a different issue, and I take exception to the idea of that, that liberalism is a bad thing. I mean, I regard myself as a liberal. I don't think anybody here would support the idea that people of different races, different genders, different sexual identities shouldn't all be given equal rights under the law. No. In that sense, we're all liberals. What I object to is, when people take liberal values and reduce them, reductio ad absurdum, they turn them into absurdities, and that's what we would sometimes call political correctness gone mad. That's the kind of thing. And there are lots of issues in modern society, about competence, about the competence of government. There are lots of issues about, like the environment. I don't think that that's a left-right issue. I think that's an issue between, anti-modern, if you like, and, pro-modern, or between scientists and non-scientists. But it's not a left-right argument, I don't think.
Well, I still don't quite. I'm not quite convinced. I mean, I see the logic of what you're saying, but if you are considered, if you're growing up in for example, like I did, all the cultural stimulus around me really was sort of from the left. I mean, that makes it sound terribly paranoid, but it basically was. I mean, if you did any kind of artistic activity, anyone you came into touch with had by default a kind of left-wing general sensibility. And, you were mentioning films there and the Queen. At the same time, yes, but everyone was very surprised that that was so sort of even-handed. They were very surprised. And yet, if you look, only last year we had The Constant Gardener about Africa, and that was also basically about these terrible pharmaceutical companies. But, where has there been a film, for example, about horrendously appalling, corrupt African dictators?
Well, yes,
this
is like...
Well, how about the Idi Amin film that's just come out?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a sort of predictability to it. I mean, there was another play on recently about the crimes of Pinochet, which, I mean, undoubtedly there, and I'm sure everyone knows about now, but, I mean, you don't see very many plays about Allende or what went on among other, or what is currently going on under left-wing leaders like Mr. Chavez in South America. There's just an inevitability that you won't see the abuses these people carry out. You won't see them because if you do a right-wing play, these are people, remember, who are the so-called establishment at the moment, who have sort of clung on to the coattails of the 68ers and who have got the delightful feeling of feeling like the revolutionaries and at the same time as being the establishment. It's a nice feeling. You get lots of money to be paid to feel like an outsider when you're entirely on the inside. And good luck to you. You've got the whole thing covered. I sense that that's coming to an end. But
this is Oriana Fallaci said, isn't she? Phony revolution, I think. I mean, this is an interesting point. I mean, you mentioned about films. You also mentioned there Ian Fleming being a very right-wing figure, Michael. That brings me really to literature very nicely. He is considered to be a right-wing writer. If you look at the writers who are considered right-wing figures, we have Frederick Forsyth and George MacDonald Fraser. And they are considered to be they're known as being right-wing simply because they spout right-wing things.
But fairly outrageously right-wing.
Yes, but do we in literature, I mean, are we approaching this the wrong way to look for a particular political... I mean, to me it seems that they cover the base on all these sort of subjects. They cover sexism, they cover racism, they cover multiculturalism, in the general same...
I think it is dangerous to look at people purely in terms of where they are in the spectrum. I mean, Martin Amis, for instance, started off as being a fairly predictable left-wing mouthpiece, and now in his more recent books, talking about Stalinism, Islamism, he's become much more... I wouldn't say he's become Kingsley Amis, which is probably a good thing, but he's shifted further that way.
But don't you remember that, when he wrote Corba the Dread about Stalin and Laughter in the 20 Million, it was sort of viewed at the time, good Lord, this is amazing. He's written, well, why did we not know about this? Why, for example, when we know so much about the Holocaust, and quite rightly too, and why there are so many films about Hitler and the Third Reich, quite right too. Why is it that I have never seen a film or a TV production or a play about Mao and the 70 million?
Because the
or
left,
Stalin
because
and
the
the
left
40
has
million.
the left has a very strong reason not to comment on these things, because so many of them were fellow travellers. I mean, so many of them until recently, actually until the recent biography of Mao came out in English, so many people until even the last few years were still calling themselves Maoists. I mean, they jumped off Leninists, they jumped off Stalinists, they'd eventually jumped off various South American dictators and others, and eventually they sort of remained on Mao. I still regard myself as a Maoist. I mean, you could still hear that a few years ago. Luckily not now. But if that was your intellectual lineage and you discovered that the people who you'd been adoring from afar had been slaughtering their fellow countrymen by the tens of millions, then I think there's every reason to avoid it.
Do you think that actually, Marxism, if you like, and communism actually gets a rather sort of soft ride still?
Absolutely. I'll give you one exception, though. Zadie Smith's last novel, On Beauty, I was quite surprised that it deals with a left-wing university milieu in a very even-handed way. She's quite critical of this very complacent left-wing 68 figure. Yeah. And she brings in a character who's modelled, I think, on Naipaul. And although he's not totally attractive, he's given a fair amount of space to make his point. That wouldn't have happened 15, 20 years ago. I mean, it would have been much more straightforward. So someone like Zadie Smith is coming forward and escaping the old, the straitjacket that people impose on writers and artists. But I would go back to this problem that the culture is dominated by one particular generation which has its own worldview. And, for instance, someone like Zadie Smith, they expect a black writer to write about black subjects and strike a particular pose. It's very difficult for a black writer who doesn't take that line to actually find an agent or a publisher. Zadie Smith has managed through sheer talent to create a position where she can now speak her mind, and I would hope that she'd continue on that path.
You're disagreeing with that, Susan? You pulled a face.
Well, I mean...
I'm not talking about white teeth, I'm talking about On Beauty. But.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm cynical in that I think that Zadie Smith, who's a beautiful young woman, kind of popped up as a poster girl for a kind of anguished examination of multiculturalism. I don't think she's the greatest writer out there.
No, I wouldn't say she was, but she's expressing particular points of view.
Yeah, and good for her for not being kind of trapped in the straitjacket that perhaps she so strongly has been given. However, it's not all. I mean, for example, Philip Roth is my favourite American novelist. In no way could he be described as a creature of the left. Right, he's made rampant assaults on, political correctness. He's stirred up, the whole bit. He outraged his own community, the Jewish community, with Portnoy's complaint. In that he was like, I'm a Jew, I'm allowed to satirise Jewish life, and it caused a great uproar. I think his work is so passionately humane that you actually can't put it in the end in any political box.
Yes, you could put his compatriot Saul Bellow in a political box.
Yes,
and
you
often
could.
has been. And Saul Bellow is a good example of a modern novelist who really did manage to sort of break out of a political mould. I mean, Mr. Samler's Planet and various others books of his that sort of really fit that definition of a sort of liberal who's been mugged by reality. I mean, they really are about somebody who desperately would like to be liberal, but has come across the world and realised it just doesn't work.
But actually, so this is the case more in America.
Yeah, American literature is much more free.
Or possibly in France, with Michel Houellebecq.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We actually don't have... We seem to have the same roster of people. They write columns, don't they, in newspapers as well. And basically they do the same. They come out with roughly... this must be one of the reasons why people don't bother to read
Yes, I mean, that's one of the extraordinary things about Houellebecq. I mean, he is a genius of kinds. But, I mean, Houellebecq is also like a sawn-off shotgun in his approach to the whole world. I mean, he simply offends everyone.
Well, it's a shock tactic.
It is a shock tactic. Sometimes it works, in my opinion. Sometimes, there's something sort of stimulating about it. But, I mean, there was one moment in his latest novel, or in Platform, where he talks about feeling a sexual thrill every time that he hears that the Palestinian suicide bombers blow themselves up. There's one less Palestinian. And I mean, I dropped the book when I gave it. It was absolutely horrifying. I didn't think I was shockable anymore, but Welbeck did it. Sometimes there's no point in it. Sometimes there is a point in what he said.
In a way, why shouldn't we read something that is sexist? You see, it seems to be that the assumption now somehow is that if you're reading it, you're condoning it somehow. Isn't that right? Or watching it. I mean, I wonder, Michael, you've been in television for many years and commissioned programmes. Did you ever commission drama?
Not really, no. I mean, I had responsibility for the drama department, but I wasn't particularly directly involved. And in fact, all we did was run Family Affairs, which was a soap opera. Right. So I can't claim that I had a huge input into it.
But do you think that, I mean, people in television, is it, paranoia, conservative paranoia, to say that they basically have a particular kind of attitude?
I'm sort of, as I say, I keep coming back to the fundamental point, which is, I think, one needs to try to distinguish between battles that were being fought in the 70s and 80s and battles which are being fought today. I mean, I think in the 70s and 80s, when there was still an argument about socialism and capitalism and Thatcherism versus, Marxism and so on, I think there were all those arguments going on, and I think there were, voices on both sides. I mean, that's not an issue anymore, and because it's not an issue, it doesn't really intrude. I come back to the point that, maybe the organisation of our society, political correctness, the values, moral values, the ideas of morality and so on, these are the issues where it seems to me the battles are being argued about. And that's not a left-right thing exactly. That's a slightly different issue. I mean, I don't exactly know how you characterise it, but to me right-wing is, I wouldn't call myself right-wing. Yeah, I don't want to support a lot of the sort of politically correct nonsense that goes on in modern Britain. But I wouldn't say that in opposing that, that makes me either illiberal or, right-wing. So I have an issue with the definitions.
Right. Well, I mean, what's actually muddied the waters maybe for you and for many people is that, along comes a religion which could actually be talked of as extremely right-wing. I mean, Islam. Yeah. And that's what's actually made the whole thing very difficult.
You can only talk about it as right-wing if your definition of right-wing is a propensity to genocidal violence.
Yes.
And lots of people do use that as a definition of right-wing. People say somebody's to the right of Genghis Khan. I mean, Genghis Khan was right-wing because he killed people. People on the left don't kill people. I mean, to that extent, the right wing as a definition is I agree, it's pretty useless these days. The left wing isn't useless. I mean, still does define a particular mindset. But
and would you say that left wing in that sense means sort of socialist?
Yes.
No, you see, I would disagree with you, because this is the crucial point. It seems that Robert Conquest has just written a book called The Dragons of Expectation, which is superb on this. He says that it's not actually socialist anymore, that it's actually just a rag bag of ideas, sort of like that have been shaved off.
The bottom line is because...
I think ideas organise around the war and the anti-war movement now. I think that has blown many of our former definitions of left and right out of the water. Moreover,
but that's
the party
just a very short. That's a very temporary little argument.
I'm not sure.
I mean, that's not a fundamental argument in the sense that a clash of major ideologies was. This is an argument about a
the clash of major ideologies on this one. I mean, is certainly interesting, because I mean nobody would have predicted in 2000 that if you had brought along a homophobic, anti-female, everything like that, theo-fascist religion, very few of us would have predicted that the left would have jumped on board to quite the extent that it has. But one is constantly surprised.
Well, they're very confused because because they want to be anti-American and anti-Bush and anti-capitalist, so they want to be anti all of that. But at the same time, they're not entirely in favour of all the ideas that the extreme Islamites,
And as I saw in Trafalgar Square a few years ago, when the call to prayer went up, all the left bowed their heads and was silent for the first time that day.
Sorry, Susan, you go.
Well, I just wanted to give you an example of the point that I've just made, that things are organising now around the war. Cracker, the new Cracker, with Robbie Coltrane, written by Jimmy McGovern. Here we had a sort of a writer who's become almost sacred in his leftism, taking, to my mind, although people went, it's so sophisticated, he's comparing terrorists in Northern Ireland to, the situation in Iraq. I was like, isn't it marvellous? The first time I ever read that. This was full of the most vicious and crude stereotypes of Americans. It was actually a text that was deeply racist in certain directions in its own way. That goes completely unexamined.
That's part of the course, isn't it?
It's part of the course. On the other hand, Paul Abbott, I think people aren't being sophisticated enough in their distinctions, because Paul Abbott's Shameless, which I think is fantastic drama, doesn't really, although he's seen to be in the same sort of leftist mould as McGovern, he's totally different. You could actually posit that family in Shameless as a sort of microcosm of the beginning of Enterprise or something like that. And it's properly entertaining and has moved away from magic prop.
Yes.
I'm going on too much.
No. I mean, I think it's interesting because I suppose I tend to have that view that somehow it is all tarred with the same brush, essentially, and that the people, you can pretty much, whether it's a South Bank show or ITV or Channel 4, generally the people that are drawn to work in those fields will, on the whole, have, should we say, that rag bag, that basket of general views, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you say, Michael?
No, I don't. I mean, I just think, honestly, I don't recognise the world. I don't recognise the world that you're describing. I mean, look at Channel 4. Everyone goes on and on and on about Channel 4 and thinks it's all full of kind of lefty agitprop, and it's a hangover still from the 1980s and stuff. I mean, we were talking earlier on this evening about, That'll Teach 'Em, which is a thing that's been running on Channel 4 about kids being sent back to school in the 1950s and back to a secondary modern comprehensive non-comprehensive education in the 60s. That's on Channel 4, and there are lots and lots of programmes which fall into that category.
If you polled the people who work at Channel... I mean, I'm not joining in this conspiracy theory, but if you polled the people who work at Channel 4 and asked them who they voted for, how many would vote Conservative?
I have absolutely no idea.
Well, I think
absolutely no idea.
We'll have to find out for the next show, and I'll come back to you. Anyway, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for this week. So thank you very much to my guests here, and I hope you join us next week. Good night.